For 17 years, the FBI chased a man they could not predict, could not profile, and could not understand. A man who built bombs so precise that agents believed multiple specialists were involved, only to discover later that every component came from one mind. A mind sharper than the engineers he targeted, a mind cold enough to watch strangers bleed and call it necessary. They called him the most intelligent criminal in America. Not because he escaped into the woods, but because he turned a 12-foot cabin into a laboratory of terror. No electricity, no water, no help. Yet from this box of rotting boards, he handcrafted devices that shredded metal, crippled scientists, and nearly brought down a commercial airplane. He left no fingerprints, no fibers, no mistakes. Every trap was calculated, every detail intentional, every victim chosen to make a point only he understood. It is April in the Montana wilderness. The ground is frozen, the trees stand like walls, and a line of federal agents moves toward the cabin of the ghost who humiliated them for nearly 2 decades. Each step is measured, each breath controlled. They know his bombs can be triggered by pressure, by heat, even by curiosity. They know he studies human behavior and predicts it with terrifying accuracy. This is not a man who acts on impulse. This is a man who plans the way other people breathe. The cabin finally appears. Small, silent, harmless to anyone who does not know the truth. Inside is the architect of a campaign that changed airport security forever. A man who turned the simple act of opening a mailbox into a moment of fear for millions. The agents surround the door. No one speaks. No one moves. Because the man behind that wall of splintered wood is not just a killer. He is a genius who chose to use his brilliance to destroy. And this knock will decide whether he ever kills again. Long before he became the phantom in the woods, he was the boy every parent bragged about and every teacher feared they could not challenge. His mind worked at a speed most people never feel in a lifetime. At 8, he solved college-level problems for fun. At 12, he outpaced his teachers. By 16, he walked onto the campus of Harvard University. Not as a visitor, not as a hopeful applicant, but as a full student surrounded by people twice his age. And yet, the moment he arrived, the brilliance that set him apart became the very thing that isolated him. Harvard was loud, competitive, polished. Ted was quiet, stiff, awkward, a working-class kid lost in a world built for the wealthy and confident. His clothes were plain, his social skills were thin. His intelligence, however, was impossible to ignore. Professors described him as unusually gifted, yet unusually unreachable. Students whispered about him as if he were a glitch in the system, something they had never seen before and did not know how to speak to. The loneliness dug in early. Nights passed in silence. Meals were eaten alone. Conversations were rare, and when they happened, they cut. Classmates mocked the way he spoke, the way he dressed, even the way he stood. He was a genius in a world that judged him by everything except his mind. But someone else noticed him for a different reason. A psychology professor, respected on campus and connected to projects no student ever heard about, began scanning the freshman class for certain types of minds. Not the popular ones. Not the confident ones. The fragile ones. The isolated ones. The ones who might bend under pressure. Ted fit the criteria perfectly. He was invited to participate in what looked like a harmless academic study. A survey of beliefs, a discussion on identity, nothing out of the ordinary. But what waited for him behind that door was not a discussion. It was a dismantling. What began as an invitation soon became an attack on everything he believed about himself. He walked into that room with a brilliant mind. He would walk out with something broken, something that would grow in the shadows for years. And that fracture, invisible to everyone around him, would become the first quiet step toward the man the FBI would one day call the most intelligent criminal they had ever chased. What Ted walked into at Harvard was not a study. It was an ambush disguised as research, a psychological trap engineered to squeeze the mind until something inside snapped. The experiment began with a simple request. Write down your deepest beliefs, your core values, the ideas that shape who you are. For a boy desperate to be understood, it felt almost comforting. He poured himself into the assignment, believing for once that someone wanted to hear his voice. But the moment he stepped into the interrogation room, the mask came off. Bright lights flooded his eyes. A camera pointed at his face. Electrodes were strapped to his body to track every tremor, every spike of stress. And across from him sat a trained interrogator. Not a student, not a peer, but a psychological strategist whose job was to crush the subject sitting in front of him. The interrogation started soft, then sharpened like a knife. His beliefs were mocked, ripped apart with precision. His intelligence was twisted against him. Every sentence he had written was used as a weapon, thrown back at him with venom, with laughter, with a coldness meant to puncture pride and identity. He was told he was naive. He was told he was weak. He was told his ideas were childish fantasies built by a boy pretending to be a man. And the worst part was not the humiliation. It was the betrayal. He thought he was being studied. Instead, he was being dismantled. These sessions did not happen once. They happened again and again, week after week, month after month, for 3 straight years. He would sit in that chair, wired to machines, forced to listen as strangers tore away his sense of self. Then afterward, he was made to watch the recordings, reliving the humiliation on screen, trapped inside the very moments he wanted to forget. For other students, the experiment was uncomfortable. For Ted, it was catastrophic. Each session pushed him further from the world he already struggled to tolerate. Each insult sank deeper, feeding the bitterness that was already growing in the corners of his mind. The humiliation hardened into resentment, resentment hardened into anger, and anger began shaping itself into something darker. When the experiment finally ended, Ted walked out the same hallway, but he was not the same person. Something inside him had split, quietly, permanently, a sharp, invisible fracture, and over the years that followed, that fracture would evolve. It would become ideology, then obsession, then violence. A brilliant mind had been pushed past the point of return, and all it needed now was isolation, silence, and time. When Ted walked away from Berkeley, he did it with the same cold precision he used in every part of his life. No farewell drinks, no explanations, no plan to return. One morning he was the youngest professor in the department. The next, his office sat empty, the chalk dust still on the board from a lecture he would never finish. To everyone else it was madness. To Ted, it was liberation. He retreated to Montana, where the sky felt endless and the world moved slowly enough for him to breathe. On a remote piece of land carved out of the forest, he built a cabin so small it could barely contain a single bed. But to him, it was more than a shelter. It was a bunker, a laboratory, a sanctuary from a civilization he believed was poisoning the human race. At first he tried to live simply, hunting rabbits, cutting wood, trying to convince himself that nature alone could quiet the storms inside his mind. But silence does not erase anger, it amplifies it. And with no distractions left, every wound from his past began to flare. The years of humiliation, the experiments that stripped him down, the sense that the world was evolving into something cold and mechanical, all of it twisted into a single idea. Someone had to strike back. That was when the transformation began. He scavenged junkyards for scrap metal and mechanical parts, stuffing them into a pack and hauling them back through the woods like trophies. His cabin slowly filled with wires, metal plates, nails, battery fragments, and chemical jars labeled in his cramped handwriting. The small room turned into a workshop of controlled chaos. Every tool had a purpose, every measurement was exact, every component was tested, filed, polished, and modified until it was untraceable. His first bomb looked handmade, almost clumsy. But investigators immediately noticed something unsettling. No fingerprints, no serial numbers, no manufacturing marks. Even the wood was carved by hand, smoothed until it looked almost unnatural. This was not the work of a hobbyist. It was the work of a mind stripping away every clue before leaving the package behind like bait. When that first explosion hit a university campus in 1978, Ted did not celebrate. He observed. He studied the reaction like a scientist analyzing data. And then he improved. His next bomb was stronger. The wiring more sophisticated, the triggers more creative. His craftsmanship evolved at a speed investigators could not match. Each device became a message in a language only he understood, a declaration that he would not stay silent while society marched deeper into the future he feared. To the FBI, the attacks looked random. To Ted, they were steps in a growing war. He was not just building bombs in that cabin. He was sharpening a weapon he believed the world deserved. For years, the bombs arrived without warning. No signature, no motive, no pattern that investigators could trust. Universities, airlines, research labs, private companies. To the public, it felt like chaos. To the FBI, it felt like a taunt. But to the man in the Montana woods, each attack was a chapter in a mission he believed only he understood. Then, after a long silence that made the nation think he might have disappeared, a new package arrived at a major newspaper. Inside was not a device, but a manifesto. 56 pages of arguments against modern society, written with the tone of a man who believed he saw a truth the rest of the world refused to face. He warned that technology was stripping away human freedom, that progress had become a threat, and that society was marching toward a future without individuality. But the most chilling line was the demand at the end. "Publish this," he wrote, "and I will stop." The FBI faced a nightmare choice. If they refused, more bombs might arrive. If they agreed, they would be giving a killer exactly what he wanted. After days of debate, they made a calculated gamble. They approved publication, hoping that someone out there would recognize the voice behind the rage. And someone did. Hundreds of miles away, Ted's brother David hesitated before reading the manifesto. He had tried to ignore the growing suspicion, the uneasy comments from his wife, the fear that the timelines and the details lined up a little too well. But once he began reading, everything changed. The tone, the logic, the phrasing. It sounded like Ted, exactly like Ted. He reread paragraphs, hoping he was wrong. He was not. The cadence matched the letters Ted had sent for years, the same patterns of thought, the same spiraling arguments about society and control. Line by line, the truth pressed harder against his chest. He knew this voice, and he knew what it meant. If he stayed silent, innocent people could die. If he spoke, he would betray the brother he had once camped with, argued with, admired. The choice tore at him, but the responsibility refused to let go. With a heavy breath and shaking hands, David made the call to the FBI. And for the first time in 17 years, the ghost in the cabin finally had a name. When federal agents finally moved toward the cabin, they did it with the caution of people approaching a live minefield. The structure was small, silent, and looked abandoned, yet every agent knew exactly who was inside. The ghost they had chased for 17 years. The man whose bombs showed no fingerprints, no fibers, no mistakes. A criminal so precise that investigators once believed several masterminds had been working together. Now they were about to meet him face to face. A decoy was used. A simple knock. A harmless request. Something ordinary, something that would make him open the door instead of reaching for whatever he kept under his bed. When the door creaked open, the agents saw him. Thin, unshaven. Covered in gray metal dust from grinding aluminum for another device. His expression flat, almost bored, as if he had been expecting nothing more than another quiet day. The arrest was quick, but what they found inside the cabin froze them in place. Dozens of chemical jars. Tools sharpened down to needles. Handmade components sorted with surgical care. And beneath his bed, wrapped tightly and ready to ship, a fully assembled bomb aimed at yet another stranger who had never heard his name. Then came the journals. 40,000 pages. Some written in code so complex that analysts compared it to Cold War encryption. Page after page detailed test explosions, calculations, confessions, and thoughts that revealed the man behind the terror. The manifesto had been polished. The diaries were raw. In those pages, the public image of a troubled philosopher collapsed. What remained was darker. He expressed pleasure in the pain he caused. He raged at neighbors, scientists, women, anyone who annoyed him. His hatred was not noble or ideological. It was personal. In court, he fought against any attempt to label him mentally ill. He insisted his actions were logical, necessary, part of a mission he believed history would one day understand. He pled guilty, refusing the narrative of insanity. He chose life in a concrete cell over the idea that his mind had ever been cracked. For decades he wrote letters from prison, attracting admirers who saw brilliance where others saw cruelty. But his private writings told the truth. The genius was real. The violence was also real. And the cabin had been the perfect place for both to grow unchecked. In 2023, after years of declining health, he ended his life in federal custody. The chapter closed, but the questions he left behind still linger. How does a mind so brilliant turn so dark? How does isolation reshape anger into ideology? How many signs were missed along the way? The answers remain buried in the pages he left behind and in a cabin that still stands as a reminder of what one mind can become when it is left alone for too long. If you want more stories told with this depth and detail, consider subscribing. It helps the channel grow and lets us bring you more true crime cases that deserve to be understood, not forgotten.